uns mit Gebet anfangen.
Allmächtiger Herr, wir danken dir, dass du uns doch wieder an diesem Abend zusammengeführt hast.
Almighty Lord, we thank you that you've brought us again this evening together.
Und gemäß deiner Verheißung bitten wir doch, dass du die Cherubime, die Gesalbten, die vor dir stehen, doch senden mögest mit dem Öl.
And according to your promise, the cherubims that stand before you, the anointed ones, that you would send them with your oil.
Und dass dieses Öl doch in die Leuchter gegossen werden kann, so wie die Typen und Symbole es uns lehren, dass dieser Leuchter auch leuchten möge.
And that this oil could be poured into the lamps, as the types and symbols show us, that these lamps may burn bright.
Und dass wir doch unsere vollständige Abhängigkeit von dir daran auch erkennen mögen.
And that we would recognize our total dependence upon you.
Bitte gib doch Bruder Lorenz die richtigen Worte und segne doch auch die Übersetzung wie die Technik.
So please give Brother Lawrence the right words, bless the translation and also the technique.
Und mögest du doch die Herzen aller Zuhörer öffnen, dass der Samen auf guten Boden fällt.
And please open the hearts of everyone who hears, that the seed may fall on the good ground.
Und dass du uns doch daran erinnerst, an unsere Aufgabe, dass wir alle Dinge prüfen und das Gute behalten mögen, dir zur Ehre in Jesu Namen.
And that you would help us to prove all things and to hold fast the good to your honor. In Jesus' name.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Okay, so posted the notes in the live stream group.
So, ich habe die Notizen in der Livestream-Gruppe gepostet.
And yesterday evening, brother Stefan asked for a repetition on this topic about the fines.
Und gestern Abend hat Bruder Stefan gefragt nach einer Wiederholung über diese Themen über den Geldstrafenzahlen.
And therefore we will go through it once more.
Deswegen werden wir das nochmal hindurchgehen.
And he also asked about this topic about fleeing, you know.
Er hat auch über diese Themen des Flüchtens gefragt.
And actually I wanted to combine these two thoughts into one, but then I found something about the fleeing that I first want to look at more closely.
Und ich wollte ursprünglich diese zwei Gedanken in eins zusammenbringen, aber dann habe ich irgendetwas über das Flüchtens entdeckt, die ich erstmal nochmal näher anschauen möchte.
And maybe then tomorrow morning we can look at it if I find the time to study it out and if the Lord would explain it clearly.
Und wenn ich die Zeit finde, das auszustudieren und der Herr das klar mich zu verstehen geben möchte, dann können wir das morgen früh anschauen.
Okay, so now let's first begin with not with the notes but with the first quote I posted in the livestream group.
So, lasst uns anfangen. In der Livestream-Gruppe vor den Notizen ist ein Zitat, die ich gepostet habe.
SPM 21.1 and 2.
Das ist SPM 21.1 und 2.
Okay, in this, I don't know, maybe you remember, this was this interview that they had with Sister White about Sunday labor and so on and so forth.
Und vielleicht erinnert ihr daran, dass wir diesen Interview, die sie hatten mit Schwester White, über den Arbeiten am Sonntag.
Okay, so they asked her the question, should not those in the southern field work on Sunday? And then Sister White replies,
White erwidert diese Frage.
if they do this, there's danger that as soon as the opposing element can get the slightest opportunity, they will stir up one another to persecute those who do this, and to pick off those whom they hate. At present, Sunday keeping is not the test. Okay, so that is very important. Okay.
Das ist sehr wichtig im Moment. Sonntags ist nicht der Test.
So therefore, it was the time when there was still a civil Sunday law and not a religious one.
So, es war eine Zeit, wo es immer noch eine zivile Sonntagsgesetz gegeben hat und noch nicht eine religiöse Sonntagsgesetz.
And therefore, she now replies with respect to the current situation. Okay.
Und sie antwortet der Frage in Bezug auf der gegenwärtige Zustand.
So at present, Sunday keeping is not the test. The time will come when man will not only forbid Sunday work, but they will try to force men to labor on the Sabbath. Yes, this is then the real Sunday law.
Das ist der wahre Sonntagsgesetz.
Sunday, you're not allowed to work, and you also are forbidden to keep Sabbath.
So, wenn Sonntag du nicht erlaubt bist zu arbeiten, aber du bist verboten, den Sabbat zu halten.
You must labor on Sabbath.
Du musst arbeiten am Samstag.
And men will be asked to renounce the Sabbath and to subscribe to Sunday observance or forfeit their freedom and their lives. But the time for this has not yet come, for the truth must be presented more fully before the people as a witness. What I have said about this should not be understood as referring to the action of old Sabbath keepers who understand the truth. They must move as the Lord shall direct them, but let them consider that they can do the best missionary work on Sunday. Okay, so here we can see basically that she says, all right, even in the civil Sunday law, you should not labor on Sunday. Okay, it's not necessary.
Das sagt sogar in dem zivilen Sonntagsgesetz, dass du solltest nicht arbeiten am Sonntag. Ist nicht notwendig.
But she also says this is not yet the test, and the test will come when the religious Sunday law will come.
Sie sagt aber auch, dies ist noch nicht der Test, sondern der Test wird kommen, wenn der religiöse Sonntagsgesetz aufkommt.
Okay, now let's go to our notes.
So, gehen wir jetzt zu unseren Notizen.
Let's go to this first quote.
Zu dem ersten Zitat.
And this is then also in conjunction with what we just read.
Und das ist im Zusammenhang mit das, was wir soeben gelesen haben.
Basically, the similar thought that she utters here.
So ein ähnlicher Gedanke, die sie hier spricht.
She says, then with regard to the Sunday question, I read in the paper of one man who was 1 hour late closing his door, and he had to pay a fine for it. Okay, so what was he to pay?
So, was sollte er bezahlen?
A fine, right?
Eine
For
Geldstrafe.
not closing his shop early enough because of Sunday arrest.
Weil er seinen Laden noch nicht früh genug zugemacht hat, wegen den Sonntagsruhen.
And she goes on to say,
Und sie sagt weiter.
now, how does God look upon it? Why we have got to act as men and women that have minds and souls and that are under obedience to God. Now, if they should come here and say, you must close up your work and your presses on Sunday, I would not say to you, keep your presses going, because the conflict does not come between you and your God. So, only if they forbid Sunday labor is not yet something that you should resist. Okay.
So, nur weil sie verbieten das Arbeit am Sonntag, das ist nicht irgendeine Sache, die du widerstehen musst.
Okay. Because it's not where you would violate God's law with it.
Weil
Okay.
es ist noch nicht eine Sache, womit du Gottes Gesetz brechen willst.
But now she says,
Aber jetzt sagt sie,
when they go a little farther and say you must keep Sunday and you shall not observe Saturday, then everyone that took the position would have the mark of the beast. Okay? So therefore, if you then would obey their law, then you would receive the mark of the beast.
wenn du dann ihrem Gesetz gehorchen würdest, würdest du die Malzeichen des Tieres erhalten.
Okay, so yeah, you must therefore differentiate, is it already the test or is it not yet the test? Okay.
Da musst du entscheiden, ist es nun mal den Test jetzt oder noch nicht.
Okay. And then she says,
Dann sagt sie,
if the authorities should say, don't carry on work here on Sunday, and we know what they will do, there's plenty you can do. You can go on missionary work and make that a day in which you will see what you can accomplish in the work of drawing souls to Jesus Christ. For God does not want us to gratify the devil by defying the powers. So, under the civil Sunday law, just obey it and do something wise with your time. Okay?
so, am zivilen Sonntagsgesetz sollst du es gehorchen und irgendetwas weise mit deiner Zeit anstarten.
But if you would not obey it,
Aber wenn du es nicht gehorchen
then you would
würdest,
bring unnecessary trouble upon you. That's what she's
du
basically
wirst
saying.
unnötige Trübsal über dich bringen. Das ist das, was sie dir sagt.
You know, when Peter asked Christ about paying tribute, he said, are not all the children free? But said he, lest he should offend them, do you go down to the sea, and the first fish that you take up, open its mouth, and do you take that piece of money, and do you pay for yourself, Peter, and for me? Okay, so even though the Lord gives us the freedom to labor on Sunday,
Obwohl der Herr uns die Freiheit gibt, am Sonntag zu arbeiten,
it would not be wise to exercise this right in this particular situation.
es werde nicht klug sein, diese Recht auszuüben unter diesen Umständen.
Because you only bring unnecessary troubles upon you and you would not gain any benefit from it.
Weil
Okay?
du bringst nur unnötige Trübsal über dich und du wirst keinen Vorteil davon erschaffen.
You also would not gain any benefit for God's cause. Okay?
Du wirst für die Sache des Herrn auch keine Vorteile schaffen.
But it would be much wiser just to obey this law and use the time wisely, she says here, for missionary work.
Es wäre viel klüger, das Gesetz zu gehorchen und die Zeit weise zu benutzen. Hier sagt sie, dass du es für Missionärarbeit benutzen würdest.
Then you don't need to pay any fines.
Dann brauchst du auch keine Geldstrafen zahlen zu müssen.
Can further God's kingdom.
Und es kann Gottes Königreich vorantreiben.
Okay, and that's what she basically means here, that Christ, the Lord didn't require of him to pay this tribute money here.
Und das ist, was sie meint mit Christus hier. Also der Herr hat nicht verlangt, dass er diesen Tribut oder diesen Steuer hier zahlt.
But it was more wise to basically forfeit his right in this respect here, or in this situation.
Aber in dieser Situation es war klüger, einfach sein Recht aufzugeben.
And pay this money instead of bringing trouble upon him unnecessarily by offending him.
Und
Okay.
dieses Geld zu bezahlen, anstatt dass er unnötigerweise Trübsal über sich bringt, indem dass er sie einen Anstoß erregt.
And this is a principle.
Und
Okay?
das ist ein Prinzip.
Because we should only offend them if we would otherwise break God's law. Okay? I mean, we should only offend them.
Okay.
Ja.
Also wir sollten sie nur ein Anstoß werden, wenn sie verlangen, dass wir Gottes Gesetz brechen.
Yes. Okay. So, because if they require of us to break God's law, then we should not care about whether they got offended or not.
Und wenn sie verlangen, dass wir Gottes Gesetz brechen, dann es soll uns egal sein, ob sie Anstoß nehmen, dass wir Gottes Gesetz brechen oder nicht.
Okay. And this principle of giving up your rights so far as possible,
Und dieses Prinzip, deine Rechte aufzugeben, so weit wie möglich,
meaning without breaking God's law,
so weit wie möglich, das heiße, ohne Gottes Gesetz zu brechen,
this is the Christian principle.
das ist ein
Okay.
christliches Prinzip.
And Paul, he writes about it, for instance, in Corinthians.
Und Paulus, der schreibt darüber, zum Beispiel im Korintherbrief.
And let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10.
Gehen wir zu 1. Korinther, Kapitel 10.
And then let's read verse 23.
Und lesen Vers 23.
It says here, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. Okay? So even though you might have a right to do this,
So, obwohl du ein Recht hättest, dies oder jenes zu tun,
it's not necessarily always the best to exercise this right. Okay?
es ist nicht immer das Beste, dieses Recht zu pochen oder zu üben.
And he gives an example of this in 1 Corinthians 6.
Und er gibt ein Beispiel davon in 1. Korinther Kapitel 6.
It says here, actually, no, that's not the point I want to read. I mean, here in 1 Corinthians 6, verse 12, he also again mentions this, okay?
Also hier in 1. Korinther 6, Vers 12, er erwähnt dieses Prinzip wieder.
He says again, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. And then he says in verse 13,
Dann sagt er in Vers 13,
meats for the belly, and the belly for meats, but God shall destroy both it and them. Now the body is not for fornication, but for the Lord, and the Lord for the body. And Now go to 1 Corinthians 8.
Gehen wir zu 1. Korinther 8 jetzt.
And this is here speaking about these eating things that were offered unto idols.
Und
Okay.
er spricht hier über die Sachen zu essen, die Götzen abgeopfert wurden.
So it says here, yes, but let's begin. Just see where I can begin. Okay, let's just begin in verse 1.
Jetzt fangen wir in Vers 1 an.
Now, as touching things offered unto idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifieth. So here he uses charity edifieth, right?
So hier benutzt er, dass die Liebe baut auf.
But in the other passage he says, not, all things might be lawful unto me, but not all things edify. Okay.
In der andere Passage, die wir gelesen haben, alles mag für mich Gesetz ist erlaubt, aber nicht alles baut auf.
Okay. Verse 2.
Vers 2.
And if any man think that he knoweth anything, he knoweth nothing yet as he ought to know. That's the verse you were looking for some days ago.
Nein, das ist der Vers. Oh ja, okay.
So, but now with verse 3.
Jetzt Vers 3.
But if any man love God, the same is known of him. As concerning therefore the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there's none other God but one. For though there be that are called gods, whether in heaven or in earth, as there be gods many and lords many, but to us there's but one God, the Father of whom are all things, and we in him, and one Lord Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we by him. Howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge. For some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. So he basically spoke about the situation because they bought meat back then on the market. Okay.
Er sprach über diese Situation, weil sie damals im Markt Fleisch gekauft haben.
That many of these animals were sacrificed to these pagan idols. Okay.
Und viele von diesen Tieren würden diesen heidnischen Götzen geopfert.
Yeah, but you could not tell, whether this was not offered or not. Okay.
Du konntest keinen Unterschied erkennen, ob oder.
And therefore, but some people, they had then conscience problems.
Aber einige von den Menschen, die hatten Probleme mit ihrem Gewissen.
Because they thought, maybe it was offered to an idol, and therefore they were having problems.
Sie dachten, vielleicht ist es eine Götze geopfert worden und sie hatten Gewissensprobleme damit.
Okay, now verse 8.
Vers 8.
But meat commendeth us not to God, for neither if we eat are we the better, neither if we eat not are we the worse. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. Okay, so if you have no conscience problems with this whatsoever,
So, wenn du keine Gewissensprobleme damit hast, überhaupt nichts,
you're free from this trouble, okay?
du bist frei von diesem Trübsal.
But you can cause a stumbling block to your brother who's not free from this.
Aber du kannst ein Stolperstein werden für deinen Bruder, der nicht frei ist davon.
Because it goes on to say
Und
here,
es sagt weiter,
verse 10,
Vers 10.
For if any man see thee which has knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish for whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. So you might think, okay, this brother, he eats things offered to idols, I can also do it, but he, in his mind, would eat it still as a sacrifice unto idols. Okay?
Also es mag jemand vielleicht denken, er sieht jemanden, der isst Sachen, die Götzen geopfert sind und denkt, wenn er das kann, dann kann ich das auch. Aber in seinem Verstand, er tut es noch, als wäre es Fleisch, die Götzen geopfert würden.
And therefore he worships now Satan with it. Okay.
So, deswegen betet der Satan damit an.
Okay. And then it says here,
Dann sagt es aber,
So verse 12 it says, "But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh, while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend." Okay, so Paul says, he had a free conscience with all these things, he had no problem. Okay.
Paulus sagt, er hat ein reines Gewissen gemäß all diese Sachen, er hat keine Probleme damit.
So it was lawful for him to eat it.
So es war gesetzes erlaubt, dass er es isst.
Because he had this perfect understanding of it, and he knew that in his mind everything was clear before God.
Okay. Er hat ein perfektes Verständnis dessen, er wusste, in seinem Verstand vor Gott war alles rein.
Yeah, but he was willing to give up this freedom that he had in order to not cause a weaker brother to stumble.
Aber er war bereit, diese Freiheit, die er hatte, aufzugeben, nur dass er niemanden, der ein schwächeres Glauben hat, ein Stolperstein zu sein.
And that's what he's then also referring to when we go back to 1 Corinthians 10.
Und das ist, worauf er sich bezieht, wenn wir zurück zum 1. Korinther 10 gehen.
Verse 23 and 24 again.
Verse 23, 24.
It says, "All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth." Okay, and then he says also in verse 25,
Vers 25 sagt er,
"Whatsoever is sold in the shambles, that eat, asking no question for conscience sake." Okay, so he then speaks again about these meats that were sold there. Okay.
er spricht wieder über diese Fleische, die dort verkauft wurden.
Okay, so, but yeah, this is this principle. Yeah, you should now seek the other man's wealth above your own rights. Okay.
Das ist dieses Prinzip, dass du den anderen sein Wohl suchen solltest über deine eigenen Rechte hinweg.
Unless you would break God's law with it.
Es sei denn, dass du damit Gottes Gesetz brechen würdest.
Okay, and this principle not only applies to your fellow brethren,
Und dieses Prinzip ist nicht nur deinen Geschwister anzuwenden,
but Jesus says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself." Right?
sondern Jesus sagt, liebet eurem Nächsten wie euch selbst.
So this is always a principle towards everybody.
Das ist ein Prinzip zu jedermann.
Okay, so now let's go back to the notes.
So, zurück zu den Notizen jetzt.
So we could see, therefore, that when the Sabbath question is not yet a test, you should obey this law and you should not risk paying fines. Okay?
Wir können sehen, dass wenn der Sabbatfrage noch nicht sein Test ist, du sollst dieses Gesetz horchen und nicht in Gefahr eingehen, Geldstrafen zahlen zu müssen.
Okay. So now go to this next heading, working out the fines.
Gehen zur nächsten Überschrift, also diese Geldstrafen aufarbeiten.
So the question was asked, is it wrong for our brethren to work out their fines? And she answers to it. Christ the King of Glory carried the cross upon which he was about to be crucified. The people had not the slightest semblance of right to inflict this upon him, but he did not refuse to submit. Christ suffered and died for us. Shall we refuse to be partaker of his sufferings? Let the servants pay tribute as the master did, lest others be offended. So she basically again refers back to where Christ paid this tribute money out of the fish's mouth. Okay.
Sie bezieht sich wieder zurück auf diese Zeit, wo Christus diese Tributgeld aus dem Maul des Fisches bezahlt hatte.
Next paragraph.
Nächster Absatz.
When brought before courts, we are to give up our rights, unless by so doing we are brought into collusion with God. So that's this principle, right? You should
Hier ist das Prinzip.
give up your rights as much as necessary,
Du sollst deine Rechte aufgeben, soweit wie nötig ist.
unless you would by this break God's law.
Es sei denn, dass du in dem, dass du das tust, Gottes Gesetz brechen würdest.
We are not pleading for our right, but for God's right to our service. So therefore we always need to understand that when we come before these courts, it's not about us, okay?
So, wir müssen immer verstehen, dass wenn wir vor diese Gerichten kommen, es geht nicht um uns.
Not about what rights we have or not have, okay?
Es handelt sich nicht über welche Rechte wir haben oder nicht haben,
But we always need to consider what right does God have to my service, okay?
sondern wir müssen immer in Betracht ziehen, welches Recht hat Gott auf meine Dienstleistung.
Okay. And this we need to stand steadfast for, okay?
Und dafür müssen wir gerade stehen.
And we only can serve Him if we obey His law,
Und
right?
wir können ihm nur dienen, wenn wir sein Gesetz horchen.
Okay. Instead of resisting the penalties imposed unjustly upon us, it would be better to take heed to the Saviour's word, when they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another. For verily I say unto you, I think it should be, right? Ye shall not have gone over the cities of Israel till the Son of Man be come. Okay, so here we can see that, as she says, it would be better not to expose yourself to these fines, okay?
So, hier können wir sehen, sie sagt, es wäre besser, dass du diesen Geldstrafen nicht hingibst,
But
nicht in der Gefahr gibst.
but the principle is basically to avoid them as much as possible.
Aber das
Okay?
Prinzip ist, sie so weit wie möglich aus dem Weg zu gehen.
And it can apply literally also that you might have to move city. Okay?
Und das ist auch buchstäblich anzuwenden, dass du möglicherweise auch den Stadt umziehen musst.
But she speaks about the time when it was not yet the test.
Aber
Okay?
sie spricht über die Zeit, wo es noch nicht der Test war.
Okay. But the brethren, the Adventists, they at first did not understand that this was not yet the test.
Aber
Okay?
die Geschwister hier, die Adventisten, sie haben noch nicht verstanden, dass dies nicht der Test war.
Okay. So, and therefore they acted as if it was the test
Und
already.
deswegen haben sie gehandelt, als ob es der Test war.
At least many of them. Okay?
Zumindest einige oder viele von denen.
And therefore they were not willing to submit themselves to these civil Sunday laws.
Und deswegen waren sie nicht willig, sich diesen zivilen Sonntagsgesetzen hinzugeben.
Okay, so let's read this next case.
So lass uns diesen nächsten Fall lesen.
Following this, 4 more of our brethren, this time in Henry County, were indicted. They were so and so forth. The first 4 were convicted. They employed no lawyers, believing that it was of no use, and believing the scriptures where the Lord promises to speak through His people when they are brought before magistrates. Okay, so they acted as if they were already in the real test. Okay.
So, sie haben gehandelt, als ob sie in den wahren Test waren.
And we see, what did they not take for themselves?
Und wir haben gesehen, oder wir sehen hier, was haben sie nicht für sich genommen?
Lawyers, right?
Rechtsanwalt.
Okay. So because Christ promised to be our lawyer in this time.
Weil in dieser Zeit hat Christus versprochen, unsere Fürsprecher zu sein.
Okay, and what did we study yesterday?
Und was haben wir gestern studiert?
What will qualify us to stand then before the people or the
Was
kings?
wird uns qualifizieren, vor den Menschen zu stehen oder vor den Königen?
Yeah, the light that is given for this time, right?
Das Licht, die für diese Zeit gegeben ist,
If we walk in it.
wenn wir darin wandeln.
Okay, so no lawyer that you can hire understands this message, okay?
Kein Rechtsanwalt, die du anheuern konntest, versteht was von dieser Botschaft.
So therefore he cannot give a testimony for you.
So deswegen kann er kein Zeugnis für dich ablegen.
Okay. So it goes on to say,
Es sagt weiter.
they appeared for themselves and they were convicted. Refusing to pay their fines, they were placed in the prison there at Paris. The people soon got tired of boarding them in the Paris jail. Was not Paris in France, but here in an American county.
Paris in Amerika.
And so an effort was made to work them. And finally an old obsolete law was resurrected, by which they discovered that the Paris jail was a county workhouse. Then our brethren were placed in the chain gang and worked, but only for a few days, as their time had nearly expired. I think 3 of them were in jail over the Sabbath, and an effort was made to work them on the Sabbath, and a resolution to that effect passed the board, but the sheriff refused to act in the matter. He said, "Gentlemen, if you undertake to work these men on Saturday, I will have nothing whatsoever to do with the matter." And his earnest effort in their behalf saved them from the experience of an attempt to force them to work on the Sabbath. They were then told that it would go harder with them if they persisted. And so, when they came to trial this time, not only the jail and the chain gang stared them in the face, but also the possibility that the severest punishment might be inflicted to compel them to work on the Sabbath, but they did not flinch. So this was now taken from the pioneers. Okay.
Das ist von den Pionieren, diese Zitat.
Okay. So here we can see that they were now forced, or were about to be forced to work on the Sabbath.
So, hier können wir sehen, dass die standen davor, gezwungen zu werden, auf den Sabbat arbeiten zu müssen.
Okay, but only because they did not understand the situation here. Okay?
Aber nur, weil sie ihren Zustand nicht richtig verstanden haben.
In the sense that they were thinking that this was already their test, and therefore they were acting as if they had to stand for it no matter what. Okay?
In dem Sinne, dass sie gedacht haben, dass dies der Test sei und dass die gerade stehen müssen, egal was komme.
So let's go to this next quote by Sister White.
Gehen wir zu diesem nächsten Zitat von Schwester White.
And she comments now on these kind of situations.
Und sie spricht über diese Art von Umständen.
It says, "I rise at 2 a.m. to write a few words in regard to those of our people who are being thrust into the chain gang and forced to work on the Sabbath. It is the spirit of Antichrist that inspires this oppression. Men are inspired by Satan to execute his purposes against God. The Lord has said, 'Verily my Sabbath ye shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations.' None should disobey this command in order to escape persecution. But let all consider the words of Christ. When they persecute you in this city, flee ye into another." And now she explains the principle behind what Christ means with this.
Und jetzt erklärt sie das Prinzip hinter, was Christus hier sagt.
"If it can be avoided, do not put yourselves into the power of men who are worked by the spirit of Antichrist. If the payment of a fine will deliver our brethren from the hands of the oppressors, let it be paid, rather than allow them to be forced to work on the Sabbath." So she comments on this scenario that we just read earlier.
So,
Okay.
sie kommentiert über dieses Szenario, die wir gerade soeben gelesen haben zuvor.
Everything that we can do should be done, that those who are willing to suffer for the truth's sake may be saved from oppression and cruelty. So here we can see Sister White counseled that instead of letting them now be forced to work on the Sabbath, yeah,
So, hier können wir sehen, dass Ellen White rät sie, dass anstelle, dass sie in eine Position gestellt würden, wo sie gezwungen werden, am Sabbat zu arbeiten,
they should rather pay the fine for them and get them out of there.
sie
Okay?
sollen viel lieber das Geldstrafe bezahlen und sie da rausholen.
But still, we need to consider it was in a time where the Sabbath was not the Sabbath Sunday was not the test yet.
Aber
Okay?
wir müssen immer noch verstehen, dass das war eine Zeit, wo der Sabbat-Sonntag-Situation war noch nicht ein Test.
And the Sunday law, the civil Sunday law, was no unjust law in this respect. Okay?
Und das zivile Sonntagsgesetz war kein ungerechtes Gesetz in diesem Sinne.
Sister White said it didn't come between them and God.
Ellen
Okay?
White sagt, dieses Gesetz kam nicht zwischen sie und Gott.
Okay. But the religious Sunday law, she says, it truly does. Okay?
Aber der religiöse Sonntagsgesetz wohl doch.
And this is the test, she said.
Und
Right?
dies ist denn der Test, sagt sie.
Okay. So now let's go to the reason why the Adventists back then, many of them refused to pay the fine.
So, lasst uns jetzt anschauen, warum viele von den Adventisten damals geweigert haben, das Geldstrafe zu zahlen.
So let's go to this next quote by A.T. Jones.
So, nächsten Zitat, das ist von A.T. Jones.
It says, "As previously stated in these columns, the judge imposed a fine of $2.50 in each case, and then immediately remitted the fine, expressing his regret that he could not also remit the costs. declaring that his sympathies were with the defendants, but that it was his duty to administer the law as he found it, and not as he might think that it ought to be. So the judge was actually for the Adventists in this case here.
So der Richter war eher für die Adventisten in diesem Fall.
Yeah. But he said, my hands are tied, I must judge according to the law that is written. Okay?
Aber er sagt, meine Hände sind gebunden, ich muss richten gemäß wie das Gesetz geschrieben ist.
And this is also what we need to understand. Okay?
Und das ist auch, was wir verstehen müssen.
So when we are brought before the courts,
Wenn wir vor den Gerichten gebracht werden,
these people might sympathize with us.
so wir mögen vielleicht Sympathie mit einigen bekommen,
Yeah, but they must administer the law. They cannot just say, okay, I don't judge according to what is written.
sie
Okay?
müssen aber das Gesetz anwenden. Sie kann nicht richten gemäß ihre Gefühle oder ihre Neigung.
Okay. So therefore, the thing that we need to understand is that we should win their hearts. Okay,
Also die Sache, die wir verstehen müssen, wir sollten wohl ihre Herzen gewinnen.
and that they would realize, oh, this law is unjust that I'm about to execute.
Dass
Okay.
sie erkennen werden, dass dieses Gesetz, die sie gleich ausführen werden, ist ungerecht.
Okay. So now let's continue here.
So lesen wir weiter.
Elder Colcourt and one other of the defendants were convicted on 4 indictments, 2 others upon 2 indictments each, the others upon 1 each. This makes their terms of imprisonment range from 20 to 76 days. One and all refused to pay the costs, because to do so would be to recognize the justice of their conviction and to encourage further persecution under the same prosecution under the same unjust law. Okay, so they were saying this law is unjust and therefore we will not pay a penny.
So, sie haben im Grunde gesagt, dieses Gesetz ist ungerecht und deswegen werden wir keinen Pfennig zahlen.
Yeah, but the law was not unjust. Okay?
Aber das Gesetz in diesem Fall war nicht ungerecht.
I mean, it's unjust to some extent, okay,
Also es ist in gewisser Weise ungerecht.
but it's not unjust in the sense that it comes between you and God.
Aber
Okay?
nicht so in dem Maße, dass es zwischen dir und Gott kommt.
It's not a law that the Lord wants you to break, as we saw from Sister
Es
White's.
ist nicht ein Gesetz, die der Herr möchte, dass du brichst, wie wir eben gesehen haben von dem Rat, die Ellen White gab.
Okay, but they didn't understand this back then, and therefore they acted if this was already the true Sunday law.
Aber sie haben das damals nicht verstanden und deswegen haben sie gehandelt, als wäre das der wahre Sonntagsgesetztest.
Okay, let's go to the next paragraph.
So, nächsten Absatz.
Adventists are not the enemies of law and order. They are as far removed from anarchists as it is possible for man to be. They are in all points not touching their conscientious convictions, a most law-abiding and exemplary people. The enemies can find nothing against them, except that touching the law of their God. They are subject to civil rulers in civil things, not from fear, but for conscience sake. But in all matters of religion they choose to obey God rather than man. Nor is this an exhibition of religious fanaticism. The principle thus stated is known and recognized by the best and most enlightened thinkers everywhere. In his work on moral philosophy, President Fairchild of Oberlin College says so and so forth. Okay, so we can actually jump over this paragraph
So, überspringen wir diesen Absatz
and let's continue with the next one.
und fahren wir mit dem nächsten fort.
It says, the Baptists and Quakers of New England acted upon the same principle. So now he goes back into the time of the Pilgrims, okay,
So, jetzt geht er zurück zur Zeit der Pilger,
when they came, the first settlers in America.
so die ersten Anreisenden in Amerika.
They disobeyed the laws which interfered with their religious liberty, and quietly submitted to the penalties imposed upon them, but did not resist the rulers, and the measure of religious liberty enjoyed in this country today is due largely to their fidelity to principle. The disobedient of the unjust law and quiet submission under unjust punishment witnessed so loudly against injustice and oppression that men were enabled to see the real principles involved and were led to recognize them to some degree. So this is basically also our duty, okay?
Das ist auch unsere Pflicht.
So we cannot expect that they will judge us any other than what is written in the law, okay?
Also wir können nicht erwarten, dass sie uns richten anders als das, was im Gesetz geschrieben
So
ist.
when now the serpent bite law says you get fined, okay,
Wenn diesen Schlangenbiss-Gesetz sagt, dass du eine Geldstrafe bekommst,
you will get a fine. Okay.
du wirst eine Geldstrafe bekommen.
Okay, they cannot suddenly overrule it because they're a judge. Okay,
Sie können nicht dieses Gesetz einfach hindrüber wegschauen, nur weil sie ein Richter sind.
unless there's some exclusion clause. Okay,
Es sei denn, dass es eine Ausnahmeklausel in das Gesetz geben würde.
but if there's not, then they must execute it. Okay.
Aber wenn nichts, dann müssen sie das Gesetz ausführen.
Okay, but when you then suffer silently these unjust treatments, then you can show all the people how unjust this law is. Okay.
Aber wenn du stumm diese ungerechte Behandlungen erduldest, kannst du dadurch alle Menschen zeigen, wie unrecht es ist.
Then they can come to realization for themselves that this law is false. Okay,
Kommen sie selbst zu der Erkenntnis, dass dieses Gesetz eben falsch ist.
and they will eventually put it away.
Und sie werden letztendlich es wegtun.
Okay, so let's just continue here.
Lesen wir weiter jetzt.
When Elder Holmes, the Baptist minister of Massachusetts, was sentenced to pay a fine or to be whipped in 1651, he said, "I would not give my body into your hands upon any other account. Yet upon this I would not give 100th part of a wampum peak to free it out of your hands." These were like some costly
No,
shells or whatever, I think.
nothing. It's like cheap nothing shells, something that you would find on the beach. I would not give you the 100. It's like saying I wouldn't give you the 100th part of a penny.
Okay,
So
then maybe it's just cheap.
yes,
Things,
cheap
okay.
things that you would find on the beach everywhere.
Okay, I guess. I understand. Okay, so I would not give 100th part of a wampum peak to free it out of your hands, and I make as much conscience of unbuttoning one button of my coat as I do in paying the 30 pounds in reference thereunto. Okay, so he basically says, I would never give you a penny, but I'm willing to unbutton my coat that you can whip me. Okay.
So, ich werde euch nie einen Pfennig geben, aber ich bin bereit, mein Hemd auszuziehen, wenn ihr Schläge gibt.
And then A.T. Jones goes on to say in the next paragraph,
Im nächsten Absatz sagt A.T. Jones weiter.
on the same principle, the Adventists refuse to pay a single penny. They have defrauded no man. They have corrupted no man. They have offended against no just law. They would not resist when they are put in prison. They will not seek freedom by flight. But they will not become parties to the wicked thing by voluntarily paying money as the price of their liberty. In other words, they will not purchase freedom by the payment of fines. Okay, so that's the principle behind it.
Da
Okay.
ist das Prinzip dahinter.
And so we should not try to buy ourselves out of this situation.
So, wir sollen nicht versuchen, uns aus dieser Situation herauszukaufen.
When it becomes a test of when a law comes between you and God.
Wenn
Okay?
es ein Test ist, wo ein Gesetz kommt zwischen dir und Gott.
Because this law needs to go. Okay,
Weil dieses Gesetz muss verändert werden.
and this law needs to be exposed as what it truly is.
Und
Okay.
dieses Gesetz muss enttarnt werden für das, was es ist.
Okay. And now we are in this time. We are faced with this serpent bite decree.
Und
Right?
jetzt in unserer Zeit sind wir konfrontiert mit diesem Schlangenbiss-Dekret.
Okay. And this is our test, right?
Und dies ist unser Test.
So therefore, when this test comes,
So, wenn diesen Test kommt,
we should not pay these fines.
wir sollten diese Geldstrafen nicht bezahlen.
But with all these other laws, when you're, for instance, let's say caught speeding, okay,
Also, all diese anderen Gesetze, zum Beispiel, wenn die dich erwischen, dass du zu schnell fährst,
this is not a law that comes between you and God.
das ist
Okay.
nicht ein Gesetz, das zwischen dich und Gott kommt.
You should obviously pay it.
Du
Okay?
sollst das natürlich bezahlen.
So as long as it's not a law that comes between you and God, you can pay the fine.
Solange
Okay?
das es nicht ein Gesetz ist, das zwischen dir und Gott kommt, sollst du das Geldstrafe bezahlen.
But if it does, if it's your test,
Aber wenn es dein Test ist,
then you should refuse.
dann sollst du es weigern.
You should not support it, you should not acknowledge it in any way or form.
Du sollst es nicht unterstützen, du sollst es noch nicht mal in irgendeiner Weise anerkennen.
Yeah. But obviously you should also not denounce them and defy them, okay?
Aber du sollst sie nicht absprechen und sie
Also in dem Sinne,
widerstehen unnötigerweise.
ja, also in dem Sinne
Stimulieren.
denunzieren. Ja.
Also du sollst sie nicht denunzieren.
Ja. But you should just calmly explain your reasons why you cannot obey this law.
Sondern du sollst leise und in Ruhe einfach mal deine Gründe erklären, warum du diesem Gesetz nicht gehorchen
And then
kannst.
just submit to their judgments and punishments.
Und
Okay.
dann dich einfach mal ihre Gerichte und ihre Bestrafungen hingeben.
Okay. So therefore I hope that this now became clearer. Okay.
So, ich hoffe, dass dies jetzt klarer
Or that
geworden
it
ist.
again reminded us of these
Oder
things.
dass es uns an diese Sachen wieder erinnert hat.
And that we can then see basically that now when this test comes, we must stand up for our faith.
Und dass wir sehen können, dass wenn diesen Test kommt, dass wir gerade stehen sollten für unsere Glauben.
Okay. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Then I think this is then enough for this evening,
Denn das sei genug für heute Abend.
and then we can close with our prayer.
Dann sollten wir mit unserer Gebetsrunde
Unless
schließen.
there's any question.
Es sei denn, dass jemand eine Frage hat.